Silence surrounded the Führer's desk, as the war he promised would last 1,000 years began to collapse around him. Outside, cities burned and millions marched toward death. Inside, Adolf Hitler picked up his pen. Not to issue orders, not to command armies, but to write letters, private, unguarded moments where the mask of the public dictator slipped. In those pages, hidden from speeches and propaganda, lies a chilling question. What did Hitler truly think of the German people he claimed to serve, from the earliest days of his political rise? Hitler understood the power of words. Publicly, he praised Germans as a chosen people, destined for greatness through racial purity and obedience. But in private correspondence, letters to confidants, associates, and trusted allies, a far more disturbing picture emerges. These letters reveal a man who did not love Germany as a homeland, but viewed its people as tools, raw material for his ideological experiment. In the aftermath of Germany's defeat in the First World War, Hitler's worldview hardened. He wrote obsessively about betrayal, weakness, and decay. In letters from the early 1920s, he blamed ordinary Germans for lacking the will to fight, accusing them of complacency and moral softness. To him, the defeat was not merely military, it was spiritual. He believed the nation had failed him before he had ever fully seized power. As his influence grew, so did his contempt. In private remarks written during the late 1930s, Hitler expressed frustration with what he saw as the average German's need for comfort, stability, and peace. He despised compromise. He admired sacrifice, but only when it was demanded of others. Germans, in his eyes, were valuable only insofar as they endured hardship in service of his vision. Those who questioned, hesitated, or suffered without enthusiasm were unworthy. The war years stripped away any remaining illusion of mutual loyalty. As Germany began losing ground after 1942, Hitler's letters and recorded private conversations turned venomous. He accused civilians of cowardice for fleeing bombed cities. He mocked their grief. When entire towns were reduced to rubble by Allied air raids, he did not express sorrow, only irritation that morale was weakening. The people were failing the idea, and therefore deserved their fate. Perhaps the most revealing moment came near the end. In March 1945, with defeat inevitable, Hitler dictated what became known as the Nero Decree. In private discussions surrounding it, he argued that if the German people were incapable of winning the war, then they had proven themselves inferior. In his mind, survival was a privilege earned through victory. If Germany fell, then Germany deserved to perish. The nation that had carried him to power was now, in his eyes, expendable. These thoughts were not impulsive. They were consistent with the psychological pattern evident throughout his life. Hitler's identity was fused entirely with ideology. Loyalty flowed in only one direction. He demanded devotion but felt none in return. He did not see Germans as individuals with lives, families, or fears. He saw them as extensions of himself, or obstacles to be crushed. The consequences were catastrophic. This mindset justified total war, mass mobilization, and the sacrifice of millions. It allowed him to prolong the conflict long after defeat was certain, ensuring maximum destruction of German cities and lives. His private contempt translated directly into public suffering. Every order to fight on, every refusal to surrender, carried the silent belief that those who died were simply unfit to survive. In the end, Hitler died isolated, underground, surrounded by ruins. The people he once claimed to embody were starving, homeless, and shattered. His letters remain as cold evidence of a truth too often ignored. Tyranny does not require hatred of the masses. It often begins with contempt for them. History's warning is clear. When leaders speak of destiny but write of disgust, when they glorify sacrifice yet feel no empathy, the cost is not paid by ideology. It is paid by human beings. Power without humanity does not elevate a nation. It consumes it. The private letters of Adolf Hitler expose a chilling contradiction at the heart of his rule. The man who publicly portrayed himself as the embodiment of the German people privately held them in deep contempt. Behind the carefully staged speeches, the mass rallies, and the myth of national unity, Hitler's correspondence reveals a leader who did not respect the very population he claimed to represent. These writings strip away the propaganda and show a psychological distance between Hitler and ordinary Germans that would ultimately prove disastrous. From the beginning, Hitler's relationship with the German people was transactional rather than emotional. In public, he spoke of destiny, unity, and racial brotherhood, presenting himself as a savior chosen to restore national pride after the humiliation of the First World War. Privately, however, his letters suggest a man who viewed the population not as partners in a shared future, but as instruments to be used, tested, and, if necessary, discarded. Germans were valuable to him only insofar as they demonstrated absolute obedience and a willingness to endure suffering without complaint. This contempt was rooted in his interpretation of Germany's defeat in 1918. In his private reflections, Hitler did not see the loss as the result of strategic failure or overwhelming external force alone. Instead, he blamed internal weakness, civilians who lost. Faith, workers who demanded rights, politicians who sought compromise. To him, the population had failed a brutal test of will. This belief hardened into a lifelong conviction that the masses were inherently fragile and required constant pressure, discipline, and fear to remain useful. As his power expanded during the 1930s, this attitude intensified. Hitler's letters from this period show growing impatience with everyday concerns such as food shortages, worker fatigue, or family life. These were distractions from what he considered the higher purpose of national struggle. While he publicly praised sacrifice as a noble virtue, his private words suggest that he felt little sympathy for those making those sacrifices. Suffering was not a tragedy in his worldview. It was a filter that separated the strong from the weak. The outbreak of the Second World War further exposed this divide. Early victories reinforced Hitler's belief that his vision, not the will of the people, was the true driving force of history. Success belonged to him. Failure would belong to the nation. When the tide of war turned after 1942, his private language toward Germans grew increasingly bitter. Bombed cities, displaced families, and exhausted soldiers were not seen as victims of war, but as signs of moral collapse. In letters and private conversations, he complained that civilians lacked endurance and accused them of betraying the struggle simply by suffering. This contempt reached its most extreme form in the final months of the war. As defeat became unavoidable, Hitler no longer spoke of protecting the German people at all. Instead, he argued privately that a nation incapable of achieving victory had proven itself unworthy of survival. This belief was not a sudden emotional reaction, but the logical conclusion of years of disdain. If Germans could not meet the demands of his ideology, then destruction was, in his mind, justified. The tragedy lies in the imbalance of this relationship. While millions believed they were serving their country, Hitler believed they were serving him and his ideas. He demanded loyalty, endurance, and death, yet offered no genuine care in return. His private letters reveal a leader who never truly stood among his people, but above them, judging their worth solely by their usefulness. These writings force a reevaluation of his public image. Hitler was not betrayed by the German people in the end. He had already abandoned them long before. His contempt shaped policies that prolonged the war, increased civilian suffering, and ensured that Germany's collapse would be as total as possible. In exposing this reality, the letters serve as a grim reminder that when leaders glorify a nation in words, but despise its people in private, the result is not greatness, but ruin. In Adolf Hitler's private letters and confidential remarks, a disturbing pattern emerges again and again. He did not see the German people as human beings with individual lives, fears, or hopes, but as instruments in service of an abstract ideology. while his public speeches overflowed with praise for the German nation and the people's destiny. His private words reveal a man who reduced millions of lives to mere components of a grand political and racial experiment. This dehumanizing perspective was not accidental. It was central to how he ruled, how he justified violence, and how he ultimately led Germany to catastrophe. Hitler's ideology demanded absolute obedience. In his private thinking, the value of a person was measured not by character, compassion, or contribution to society, but by usefulness to the cause. Germans were expected to work harder, fight longer, endure hunger, and die without hesitation. Those who could not meet these expectations were not pitied. They were dismissed as weak, degenerate, or unnecessary. His letters show little concern for personal suffering. Instead, they focus relentlessly on results, discipline, and ideological purity. This mindset was shaped by his belief in struggle as the natural law of history. Hitler was convinced that progress emerged only through conflict and elimination. In such a worldview, empathy became a liability. If individuals mattered, ideology would be compromised. Therefore, people had to be stripped of individuality and transformed into a collective mass, one that could be mobilized, sacrificed, and reshaped at will. In private correspondence, he repeatedly framed the population as material to be hardened through war, deprivation, and fear. As Germany rearmed in the 1930s, this attitude became policy. Hitler demanded total commitment from society, while insulating himself emotionally from the consequences. Families separated by conscription, workers pushed beyond exhaustion, and children indoctrinated for future sacrifice were all viewed as necessary inputs. His private writings make clear that he believed pain strengthened the nation. If people broke under pressure, that only proved they were unworthy of survival within his ideological vision. The war exposed the full brutality of this thinking. As casualties mounted and cities were destroyed, Hitler did not privately mourn the loss of German lives. Instead, he complained about declining morale and questioned the population's resolve. The suffering of civilians under relentless bombing was treated not as a humanitarian disaster, but as an inconvenience to his strategic goals. In letters and conversations, he expressed frustration that fear and grief interfered with productivity and obedience. This reduction of people to tools allowed him to prolong the war long after defeat was inevitable. Every additional month of fighting meant more deaths, more destruction, and more misery. But in Hitler's mind, these were acceptable costs. Ideology came first. The people existed to serve it, not the other way around. His refusal to consider surrender was rooted not only in arrogance, but in his belief that those who could not endure endless sacrifice did not deserve to be saved. The most revealing evidence of this worldview appears near the end of the war. As Germany collapsed, Hitler privately argued that the nation itself had failed. Instead of accepting responsibility for strategic mistakes, he blamed the population for lacking strength and faith. Infrastructure, food supplies, and even civilian survival were no longer priorities. If the German people could not fulfill the ideological mission, then their destruction was, in his logic, justified. This attitude exposes the true nature of Hitler's leadership. He did not lead in service of the people. He ruled over them as expendable assets. His private letters strip away the illusion of mutual loyalty and reveal a one-sided relationship defined by exploitation. Millions believed they were fighting for their homeland, while he believed they existed only to validate his beliefs. The consequences of this dehumanization were devastating. By treating people as tools rather than lives, Hitler made it possible to demand unlimited sacrifice without remorse. His private thoughts reveal a warning that extends far beyond his era. When ideology replaces humanity, and when leaders see citizens as means rather than ends, destruction becomes inevitable, not just of nations, but of the human soul itself. Adolf Hitler's private letters and confidential reflections reveal a worldview in which ordinary Germans were not seen as individuals with intrinsic worth, but as instruments to be shaped, driven, and consumed by ideology. Publicly, he presented himself as the voice of the nation, claiming a mystical bond with the people. Privately, however, his words expose emotional detachment and a cold calculation that stripped human life of meaning unless it served his vision. Germans, in his mind, were not citizens to be protected, but raw material in a ruthless historical process. This perspective was deeply connected to his belief that history was governed by struggle. Hitler viewed life as an endless contest in which only the strong deserved to survive. Compassion, compromise, and mercy were signs of decay. In such a system, individuals mattered only as long as they contributed to collective strength. His letters repeatedly emphasize discipline, endurance, and sacrifice, while showing little concern for personal loss or suffering. When he wrote about the population, it was rarely with empathy, but with judgment. As his political power increased, this dehumanizing view hardened into certainty. Hitler believed the masses needed to be controlled, pressured, and constantly tested. Comfort made people weak. Security made them complacent. Suffering, on the other hand, revealed character. In private correspondence, he suggested that hardship was not an unfortunate byproduct of policy, but a necessary tool. Those who endured proved their worth. Those who collapsed exposed themselves as unfit. This logic allowed him to justify increasingly extreme demands on society without moral hesitation. During the rearmament years of the 1930s, this attitude translated directly into governance. Long working hours, suppressed dissent, and relentless propaganda were imposed with little regard for personal cost. Families were separated, labor was exploited, and youth were molded into future soldiers. In Hitler's private thinking, these were not tragedies but investments. People were being shaped for war, and war, in his view, was the ultimate measure of national value. The Second World War intensified this process. Early victories reinforced his belief that sacrifice validated ideology. When success came, it confirmed his sense of superiority. When failure followed, blame shifted immediately to the people. As casualties rose and cities were reduced to ruins, Hitler's private tone toward Germans became increasingly harsh. Civilian fear and exhaustion were not seen as natural human responses, but as moral failings. He complained about declining morale, not destroyed lives. Bombing campaigns that killed tens of thousands of civilians elicited little private sympathy. Instead, Hitler focused on productivity and obedience. The suffering of women, children, and the elderly was treated as an obstacle to war efficiency rather than a humanitarian disaster. His letters and conversations reveal irritation that grief interfered with labor and discipline. This emotional distance made it possible for him to demand continued resistance even as the nation collapsed. By reducing people to ideological tools, Hitler freed himself from responsibility for their fate. Every death could be reframed as necessary. Every hardship could be dismissed as weakness. This mindset reached its most extreme form in the final phase of the war. When defeat became unavoidable, Hitler no longer saw any obligation to protect the population at all. In private remarks, he argued that if the German people were incapable of winning, then they had failed history's test. Survival, in his thinking, was a reward, not a right. This belief justified policies that accelerated destruction. Infrastructure was to be destroyed, resources denied, and civilians left to suffer rather than preserved for a post-war future. The people who had once filled stadiums cheering his name were now, in his eyes, expendable. His private words show no regret, only contempt for those who could not meet impossible demands. The tragedy of this worldview lies in its imbalance. Millions believed they were serving their nation, while Hitler believed the nation existed only to serve his ideology. There was no mutual loyalty, only exploitation disguised as destiny. His private letters expose a truth often hidden by propaganda. When leaders see people as tools instead of lives, suffering becomes policy and destruction becomes acceptable. These writings stand as a warning beyond their historical moment. Any system that reduces human beings to instruments invites cruelty without limits. Hitler's Germany demonstrates that when ideology eclipses humanity, a nation does not rise. It is consumed from within, one expendable life at a time. As Germany's fortunes began to reverse, Adolf Hitler's private letters and confidential remarks took on an increasingly bitter and accusatory tone, revealing how deeply he blamed the German people themselves for the collapse of his ambitions. Publicly, he continued to demand faith and perseverance, insisting that victory was still possible if the nation stood firm. Privately, however, he wrote and spoke as though the population had already failed him. The widening gap between his expectations and reality hardened into resentment, and that resentment would shape some of his most destructive decisions. The turning point came after the early successes of the war faded. The invasion of the Soviet Union, once imagined as a swift and decisive campaign, became a grinding struggle marked by staggering losses. As soldiers died in the millions and supply lines collapsed, Hitler did not privately reflect on his own strategic miscalculations. Instead, his correspondence increasingly focused on what he described as declining willpower at home and insufficient endurance among civilians. To him, the problem was not flawed leadership, but a population that could not sustain the level of sacrifice his ideology demanded. As Allied bombing intensified, German cities were reduced to ruins, families were buried under rubble, children were orphaned, and entire communities disappeared overnight. Yet in Hitler's private communications, these human tragedies rarely appeared as causes for sympathy. He viewed them as tests. If civilians fled their homes, sought safety, or expressed despair, he interpreted these actions as evidence of moral weakness. In his mind, true loyalty meant endurance without complaint, even in the face of annihilation. This attitude reveals a critical psychological pattern. Hitler measured worth through suffering. The more pain a person could endure, the more valuable they became in his ideological hierarchy. Those who broke under pressure were not victims, they were failures. His private letters reflect irritation rather than sorrow when reports of civilian panic reached him. Fear, grief, and exhaustion were seen as obstacles to total mobilization, not as natural human responses to catastrophe. By blaming the population, Hitler absolved himself of responsibility. Every setback could be explained as betrayal from below rather than error from above. This mindset owed him to persist in increasingly unrealistic demands. Even as Germany's military situation became hopeless, he refused to consider negotiations or surrender. Instead, he insisted that the people must fight on, not for survival, but to prove their worth. Death, in this twisted logic, was preferable to failure. The consequences of this thinking were devastating. Orders were issued to hold cities at all costs, resulting in unnecessary destruction and loss of life. Civilians were forced into last-ditch defense efforts, including the mobilization of teenagers and the elderly. Hitler's private disdain for those who lacked strength translated into public policies that consumed the nation's final reserves of human life. The population paid for his disillusionment with blood. As defeat became inevitable, his blame hardened into open contempt. In private remarks from the final months of the war, Hitler argued that the German people had proven themselves unworthy of the future he had envisioned. If they could not win, then they did not deserve to survive. This belief underpinned his willingness to destroy infrastructure and deny resources to civilians, ensuring that suffering would continue even after his own fall. This stage of the war exposes the final collapse of the relationship between Hitler and the people he claimed to represent. What had begun as propaganda-driven unity ended in mutual ruin. The leader who demanded absolute loyalty offered only condemnation in return. His private letters show that long before Germany was defeated militarily, it had been abandoned morally by the man who ruled it. In this blaming of the population lies a powerful historical lesson. When leaders refuse to accept responsibility and instead turn against their own people, catastrophe accelerates. Hitler's private contempt did not remain confined to paper. It became policy, prolonging war and magnifying suffering. The result was not redemption through sacrifice, but devastation born of arrogance, a warning that the greatest danger often arises when power answers failure not with reflection, but with blame. At the core of Adolf Hitler's decision-making was a ruthless belief that weakness was not merely unfortunate, but undeserving of survival. In his private letters and confidential reflections, this idea appears again and again, shaping his actions as the war turned against Germany. He believed that history was a merciless judge, and that only those who proved their strength through victory had the right to exist. This conviction did not remain abstract philosophy. It directly influenced policies that prolonged the war and multiplied destruction long after defeat was unavoidable. Hitler's worldview left no room for compassion. He saw struggle as the natural state of humanity and believed that suffering revealed true worth. In private writings, he repeatedly framed loss and hardship as necessary filters, separating the strong from the weak. Survival, in his mind, was not a human right, but a reward earned through success. This logic allowed him to reinterpret catastrophe as moral judgment. When Germany began losing the war, the devastation was not proof of flawed leadership. It was proof that others had failed his ideological test. As military setbacks mounted, this belief became increasingly dangerous. Rather than adapting strategy to save lives or preserve the nation, Hitler clung to the idea that perseverance itself was the ultimate measure of value. Retreat was unacceptable. Surrender was unforgivable. To admit defeat would mean acknowledging that the ideology itself was flawed. Instead, he chose to escalate sacrifice, demanding more lives to validate his vision. The war had to continue, not because victory was possible, but because endurance alone had become the goal. This thinking was especially evident in his reaction to civilian suffering. Allied bombing campaigns devastated German cities, killing tens of thousands and leaving millions homeless. In private correspondence, Hitler showed little sympathy for these victims. Instead, he expressed anger that bombing weakened morale and productivity. Civilians who broke under pressure were not seen as victims of overwhelming force, but as evidence of societal weakness. Their deaths, implicitly, were the price of failing to meet ideological expectations. The same mindset governed his treatment of soldiers. As Germany's armies collapsed on multiple fronts, Hitler refused to authorize withdrawals that could have saved countless lives. Entire units were ordered to fight to the last man, even when surrounded and hopelessly outmatched. In his thinking, survival without victory was meaningless. Soldiers who died obeying orders were useful. Those who lived by retreating were suspect. This logic transformed military command into a mechanism of ideological punishment. By 1944 and early 1945, the war had become unwinnable by any rational standard. Germany lacked resources, manpower, and strategic options. Yet Hitler's belief that the weak deserved to perish hardened into policy. Instead of preparing for peace or reconstruction, he authorized measures that increased civilian suffering. Infrastructure was destroyed, transportation systems dismantled, and resources denied to the population. If the nation could not win, he reasoned, then it should not survive intact. This approach culminated in his willingness to sacrifice Germany itself. In private discussions, Hitler argued that the German people had failed history's test by not achieving victory. Therefore, they had no claim to a future. This was not an emotional outburst, but the logical conclusion of years of contempt. The same ideology that justified expansion and conquest now justified annihilation from within. His belief in survival through strength left no place for mercy, recovery, or learning from failure. The prolongation of the war was the most devastating consequence of this mindset. Millions died in the final months alone. Soldiers ordered into futile battles, civilians trapped in besieged cities, children pressed into service. Each additional death was framed as necessary, even honorable, because it upheld the idea that survival must be earned. Hitler's refusal to surrender was not courage. It was ideological rigidity enforced through mass suffering. In the end, this belief destroyed everything it touched. Germany was left in ruins, its population traumatized, its future shattered. Hitler died having proven only one thing, that a worldview which denies human worth in favor of abstract strength will inevitably consume both leader and nation. His private letters expose the fatal flaw of his thinking, that by judging people solely through victory and defeat, he turned leadership into a death sentence for those he ruled. This history offers a universal warning. When leaders believe that the weak deserve to perish, failure becomes catastrophic rather than instructive. Wars are prolonged, lives are wasted, and suffering is justified in the name of principle. Hitler's Germany stands as evidence that ideology without humanity does not produce strength. It produces ruin, measured in lives lost long after hope has vanished. The private letters of Adolf Hitler ultimately expose more than the mindset of one dictator. They reveal a universal warning about power, ideology, and human nature. Stripped of propaganda and performance, his words show how absolute belief can corrode empathy, how authority detached from humanity turns destructive, and how a nation can be led to ruin not by enemies, but by the inner logic of its own leadership. What happened in Germany was not inevitable. It was the result of choices made by a man who placed ideology above human life. Hitler's private thoughts show a leader who believed he was an instrument of history rather than a servant of people. This belief freed him from moral responsibility. If history demanded sacrifice, then suffering became acceptable. If destiny required destruction, then compassion became weakness. Over time, this way of thinking transformed leadership into domination and governance into judgment. The people were no longer citizens to be protected, but subjects to be tested. Their worth was measured not by survival, but by obedience and endurance. This is where the true danger lies. When leaders convince themselves that they represent a higher truth, they begin to see disagreement as betrayal and suffering as proof. Hitler's letters reveal how easily moral boundaries can collapse once power is justified by destiny. Every failure was blamed downward, every tragedy reframed as necessity, responsibility dissolved, replaced by certainty. And certainty, when left unchecked, becomes lethal. The German people paid the price for this transformation. Millions followed, trusted, and sacrificed, believing they were part of a shared national struggle. Yet Hitler's private words show that this loyalty was never reciprocated. When hardship intensified, he did not see courage or pain, he saw inadequacy. When cities burned, he did not grieve, he evaluated. When defeat loomed, he did not protect the future, he condemned it. This imbalance between what was demanded and what was given reveals the moral emptiness at the center of his rule. History often remembers dictators through their crimes, their wars, and their downfall. But Hitler's private letters remind us that catastrophe begins earlier, before action. Long before the final battles, the ideology had already erased the value of individual life. Once that erasure occurred, destruction followed logically. Policies that prolonged war, orders that sacrificed civilians, and refusals to surrender were not irrational outbursts. They were the natural outcome of a worldview that denied human worth unless it served victory. The lesson extends far beyond one man or one era. Any system that glorifies abstract goals over human consequences risks repeating the same pattern. When leaders speak of purity, destiny, or greatness without empathy, people become expendable. When failure is blamed on weakness rather than examined with humility, suffering multiplies. When power refuses accountability, tragedy becomes policy. Hitler's Germany demonstrates how easily language can disguise exploitation. Words like honor, sacrifice, and loyalty were used to mask a one-sided relationship in which millions gave everything and received nothing in return. His private letters pull away that disguise. They show that the greatest betrayal was not committed by the people, but against them. A nation was mobilized, drained, and destroyed in service of an idea that offered no mercy when it failed. In the end, Hitler died alone, having abandoned even the people who sustained his power. Germany survived, but only after unimaginable loss. The ruins left behind were not only physical, but moral. Trust was shattered, lives were erased. Generations carried the weight of decisions made by a leader who believed strength mattered more than humanity. This is the enduring warning his private words leave behind. Power without empathy leads to contempt. Contempt leads to cruelty. And cruelty, once justified by ideology, knows no limit. History does not repeat itself because people forget facts. It repeats because they ignore patterns. Hitler's letters show one of the darkest patterns of all. When leaders stop seeing people as human beings, the collapse of conscience always comes before the collapse of nations.